I wake up today, check my phone, and what do I see? I see a bunch of YouTubers talking about how I'm done with D&D, I'm done with Wizards of the Coast, I'm done with these art books, I'm done with the price gouging, I'm done with woke stuff in my hobby, right? There were a lot of people like this, Clownfish TV, Happy Console Gamer, Sean Malmstrom, all these people coming out in one voice saying D&D sucks, and I'm never ever going to support it again. Barely even 1 year after the release of Baldur's Gate 3, the game of the year for 2023, people are people are making these statements that they're not happy with Wizards of the Coast. They're not happy with the current state of D&D. They're not happy with the game anymore, and they're not really interested in playing it, right? It's gotten so bad, people are pointing to like alternatives now, right? D&D is and has been for quite some time been on the decline. Game sales are down, art book sales are down. Baldur's Gate 3 sales were not as impressive as initially reported, right? I talked about all this before, but what it all amounts to is that Wizards of the Coast is losing relevancy. Even after one of the biggest shill campaigns I've ever seen in my life to try and force Baldur's Gate 3 into relevancy, right? Even after that, even after robbing Super Mario Bros. Wonder of the Game of the Year award, even after like downplaying Tears of the Kingdom, even after like the religious worship of game journals who really, really wanted to get fucked by that bear, the game, the brand as a whole is on the decline. No different than Star Wars, no different than Star Trek, no different than Marvel, right? D&D, the game that people have been desperately trying to pretend has uh, was the progenitor of fantasy. Like D&D is on the way out, and it couldn't have happened to a more deserving franchise, right? D&D for the longest time has been used to weaponize the youth against Christians. It's been used to push weird agendas. The sort of people who play D&D are just the most insane, delusional, just out of touch with reality people imaginable. And to see their favorite game start to fall by the wayside because of their catering to this audience, it's very satisfying to see, right? People are moving past D&D. They're realizing it's not that great, that it's not that impressive, that it did not invent fantasy or or whatever that fanboys are trying to pretend it's accomplished. Like D&D is not and never has been all that big of a deal, right? Zelda has been bigger. Tolkien has been uh established as a fantasy classic, right? You have like, all-time myths, like the King Arthur mythos. And D&D rips all of that off, right? It tries presenting itself as like the culmination of all fantasy, but the reality is D&D is just a knockoff pastiche product made for and sold to mediocre people who cannot appreciate real legitimate fantasy and cannot create their own, right? D&D is for losers, and it always has been. And to see people like flailing around, people like Spoonie who like name their dogs after like D&D concepts, like Thaco. What? Thaco. You're really gonna like after poor Oreo died in the most like unfortunate way imaginable. Spoonie is gonna name his replacement Thaco. Like, doesn't that like really just show you just how warped and twisted these people actually are, right? When you actually look at what these people do, how they like obsess over like past D&D campaigns, how they like complain about player stereotypes, how they try and apply real world concepts to fantasy, right? You know, how they try to pretend like orcs are black people or any of the weird subculture things that have come out over the years. Like the delusional way in which they tried to downplay The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom in favor of Baldur's Gate 3, right? Like when you really think about that, that was the most insane thing ever, right? We've already seen over the past year that Baldur's Gate 3 has completely faded from the public consciousness, right? We all know about the bots. We all know about how the sales numbers were fake. We all know like the critics were bought and paid for, that Jeff Keighley is a complete shill. Like just look at how he's handling the PS5 Pro reveal, right? Like everybody's clowning on him for like addressing the very obvious fact that he's shilling a product by being excited for the PS5 Pro. But like, the same people fail to acknowledge the reality that he was doing the exact same thing for Baldur's Gate 3, right? The CRPG genre is not something by its nature that could compete with like any Nintendo game. It is a niche thing, right? Baldur's Gate 3 only sold itself by being overly sexualized and by being overly woke to appease game journals. Like when you take those two things away from it, it really, really, really has nothing going for it. And I think history, well, actually, right now, this isn't even a really historically thing. Like right now, the fact that like Baldur's Gate 3 has had no real staying power really demonstrates a lot about how these people, quote unquote, people, right? These subhumans, they'll just come on to like they'll get excited for a product, talk about it incessantly, like it's the best thing ever, and then like a year later they'll move on to like other branded products, other licensed games, Space Marine 2 and, Astrobot, I think are the two big things now. Actually, no, like both of them have fallen off already. They're going through the same process that like Baldur's Gate 3 did, where like it has that like period of relevancy and then they just move on to the next thing, right? Meanwhile, you have people like me who are still like, oh yeah, 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. That was awesome. Fire Emblem Three Houses, one of my favorite games on Switch. I'm actually playing through the DLC for the first time ever right now, right? You know, um, Tears of the Kingdom is great. Super Mario Bros. Wonder is great. Recently I've had this epiphany that like Super Mario Advance 2, Super Mario World is like a really underrated port of a Super Mario World that really does a lot to give the game replay value and really like has a lot of quality of life improvements that really make the game feel completely different, right? Whether it's like the playable Luigi or like the Dragon Coin collecting thing, right? Like, Super Mario Advance 2 is an amazing game, right? That port is over 20 years old now, and I still like have found like a lot of value and by playing it. Like, do I feel the same way about Baldur's Gate 3? No. Do I feel the same way about Undertale? No. Do I feel the same way about like Mass Effect or Ultima? Like, no. Like, again, these products are only hyped up, they're only worshipped in order to distract the general population from the superiority of Nintendo products.